I will be speaking in English, and I'm always wondering if that's how that will go over in a German-speaking audience. But I think that, first of all, we have some tremendous translators back there who have been working with me all week long. Was that you? All week long to try to sort of get a heads up on what I'm going to deliver today. And I did have to say to them, I deeply apologize, but I tend to go off course a lot. And so my apologies to the translators right now for having to keep up with me when that does happen, yeah? The other thing I want to say is that, well, after listening to these wonderful women, there's a lot I really do want to say. Last night, Sissi said to me, I think it was Sissi, please, when this is released into an English-speaking audience, and that is what I can bring to this occasion, is that I can get this conference out and what we're saying into an English-speaking world, whether it's in the United Kingdom or in the United States. Tell them that we're desperate. Tell them we need help. And so that is the first thing I will say right now, so that it's part of the presentation, so I can say that to the English-speaking world. And I will say to you that it's also happening globally. It's happening in the United Kingdom, and it's happening in the United States. And that only means that it's that much more desperate and that much more important that everyone becomes aware that this is what is happening. What I can bring to the discussion is the study that I've made over the last few years of social engineering. And the social engineering of humanity within the last couple of centuries that has actually led us to be in a position where we find ourselves having to talk about these kinds of things because these kinds of things are occurring. Where we find ourselves watching people do this kind of thing to each other, and where we find ourselves allowing this to happen. This is a function of social engineering. It is a function of a program, a global program that has deliberately been enacted upon humanity over the last few centuries intensively. But in my opinion, I'm way off, I'm sorry, I'm already way off my speech. In my opinion, it is part of a battle that's been going on forever. It's one long battle. And it was in the last 2 centuries that the entity that lies behind the horrible things that happen to us as human beings, whom I often refer to as the predator, because it's not appropriate to use the word they, because who is they? They doesn't mean anything. So I call this collective entity that really its goal is to destroy humanity, certainly to bring about the downfall of Western civilization as the predator. Now, I do have a presentation that I do want to bring, and I will try to sort of make sure I just hit the points that are relevant to what our discussion today, number one. Number two, I'm going to give you my story to begin with, because otherwise, why in the world am I standing here, and why in the world do you need to listen to anything I have to say? Yes, this is really important that this is just about discernment. Who is it that you're listening to, and why are they standing in front of you? It's very difficult to listen to these stories if you have children, is it not? And one of the things that I was thinking before I get into my history was that I have 3 children. I have 3 children. The man that I was married to for 20 years, who was the father of, and is the father of those children, you know, he was, for one thing, he was working in New York City during 9/11, and he lost his job because of that. Things were very difficult for many, many millions of Americans post 9/11. We didn't have a job. We didn't have any money. We just had each other. We had 3 children, and we had these amazing children. 2 of my children are chronically ill. One of them certainly could be, and and is classified as disabled. There were many times we didn't know where we needed a place to live, and we didn't know where our next paycheck was coming from. So how lucky am I? How lucky am I that my children were never taken from me? How lucky am I to have these children at home, to have had my children grow up in my own home? When around me, people were losing their children for far fewer and far lesser reasons than what I just laid out. And I'm just a normal person. I'm just an ordinary American who went through periods of time where there wasn't enough money and maybe we needed a place to live. And my children were ill. And my children were ill due to the environment in which they grew up. The air around them. The demonic levels of electromagnetics that course through our bodies and change our physiology. My daughter's vaccine injured, okay? In the United States, they take children out of hospitals now and put them into social services, into care, if you refuse to have them vaccinated in the hospital, despite the fact that there is no law that says you have to. So it depends on what country we're talking about, as to the primary mode of access to children. In the United States, there's a lot going on that's centered around vaccines. But let me read to you, which I don't ordinarily do, but I'm going to because I think I should. My introduction. Bear with me, please. Okay. My name is Cara St.Louis, as you know. And this will be the only part of my presentation that I read from a script, but it's kind of long, so. I'm an American writer and teacher and lecturer and an activist, and I currently live in London. And one of the most important things that I am is I'm also a Waldorf teacher. I'm a Waldorf School Lehrerin, I think that's how you say it in Altdeutsch, and I'm very proud of that. I'm hugely proud of that, because it is protection for children in the face of other kinds of schooling, which I will talk about. And in that case, I feel like I'm simply the bearer of more bad news, but I really have to deliver my message, so bear with me on that one as well. I grew up in the American Southwest, which I consider to be, for me, the greatest good fortune. It was one of the reasons it was the greatest good fortune was because as an Anglo-American, as an Anglo-Saxon, I was in the 60s and 70s, I was very much in the minority. I was surrounded by the Native American nations and Latin American culture, which is it's a rich, delicious, delightful, amazing culture and amazing places to grow up. My mother, whom I'm going to talk about at length in a moment, was a music teacher for the first half of my life, and she taught music to the Native American tribes in New Mexico. She traveled and taught music. My family was from the Four Corners part of the United States. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with the United States, but I'm going to say that anyway. It is where 4 states join: Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. And right at the middle, just about as close to the middle as you can be and still be inside a building, is where I was born. And I was born at straight up midnight, which has turned out to be extremely important in my life. I grew up in the deserts of New Mexico with a bit of time spent in Roswell, where my younger brother was born, and in Oklahoma, where my father's family lived. And I have lived all over the world, thanks to a mother who liked to travel and explore, and who had other reasons for doing everything. I think there are a lot of people in this room who traveled the globe as children, and I think that makes us a certain voice. It's a certain voice to have that background, yeah? And I'm speaking to a well-educated audience, so I better say that I studied writing and literature at the University of Colorado, and then physics in Colorado as well. In the end, I received a master's degree in education of the Waldorf variety, and I have 3 wonderful children whom I've just spoken about. They are now grown. They are 19, 21, and 23, so they think they are grown anyway. All of them suffer deeply from the environment they found themselves growing up, which was completely manufactured and meant to injure them. That is the world that we live in. Although my life has been a series of profound experiences, the one earth-shattering event that landed me here on this stage in front of you happened to me on the morning of the 11th of July, 2010. It was a Sunday, and it was a beautiful sunny morning, and my beloved mother, who had moved to this little seaside village in which we lived to be nearer her grandchildren, was walking to church. It was about a block and a half from her apartment to the church. She was just about to the other side of the main street when a van came hurtling down the road, struck her, and sent her flying many yards into the street. She was still conscious when the ambulance collected her, but just about every bone in her body was broken, and she died with me by her side just a few hours later. And this is a horrifying experience. It really devastated the entire town. The most significant aspect of this death lay in the life of this 74-year-old woman. After she had been a music teacher, she had worked as a technical editor for the U.S. Navy in many capacities. Most people think that the NSA or the CIA or some such entity is the top of the pyramid in espionage, but I am here to tell you, it is not. The CIA is not the top dog in espionage, warfare, dark operations. It's the U.S. Navy. The King of the Hill has always been the U.S. Navy and still remains the U.S. Navy. She had, as you can imagine, a rather high security clearance, and I had an immediate and very strong intuition that my mother's death had not been an accident. I have now a mountain of circumstantial evidence that it was not. From the cars that tried to run me into oncoming traffic, to the brake lines that were cut in my car, to the anonymous copy of a police report sent to me from a source I still don't know who it was. I could not get a police report that had anything to do, any information on my mother's death. I was the sole survivor, and I couldn't get so much as one police report. So after a few months of asking and having my attorney contact the local police department to tell them that there was such a thing as the Freedom of Information Act, this envelope arrived in my mailbox with no return address, hand addressed, and it was the most simple police report that could have been generated by that incident. I still don't know who sent it, but obviously someone was trying to get me some sort of information. Yeah? So she often gave me hints, by the way, that she would die this way. I was speaking about this last night. She often gave me hints that this is the way she was going to die. She was inordinately afraid of traffic, cars that made sudden moves. She went to the local police department about 6 months before she died to make a complaint that cars didn't stop for pedestrians. And she said, you know, someone's going to get killed. I guess someone's going to have to get killed before you listen. And 6 months later, she was dead. I tried very hard to live with this for a few months and to help my children get over this incident. And then on 31st December 2010, a very important man, a man who was a liaison between the Pentagon and companies trying to get defense contracts in the United States, a man who was a security advisor to 3 presidents, was found dead in a trash bin near Washington, D.C. It was such a startling event, so seemingly random, that of course this idea of how my mother died came back to me. And I couldn't push it away. And then the next day, on the 1st of January 2011, this was the day that tens of thousands of blackbirds started to fall from the sky all at the same time, dead in Arkansas. And hundreds of thousands of fish started to wash up on the shore, dead for no reason. And a necropsy, which is what they call an autopsy that you perform on an animal, revealed there were no outside wounds on these birds at all, that all of their inner organs had been exploded. To me, this was evidence of a weapon. This was evidence of perhaps a microwave weapon, certainly some sort of a new electromagnetic weapon. Probably the United States military had been testing it on animals, and they tried to float this idea that 10,000 blackbirds had fallen dead from the sky in Arkansas because they had all been killed by the fireworks display that evening. They'd been scared to death all at the same time and dropped dead on the floor, right? Okay, so no one believes that. No one believed it then. No one believes it now. All right. I remember that my mother had worked, when she worked for the Office of Naval Research in London, that these sorts of weapons had been a big part of their research there. The Office of Naval Research, we will discover momentarily, is one of the arms, not just of the US Navy, but also of the Tavistock Institute. She worked with many, many Operation Paperclip scientists and scientists from the Eastern Bloc. I met lots of them because I went to visit my mother, and I visited her at her office, and I shook hands probably with the men who were responsible for chemtrailing and a lot of the electromagnetic weaponry that it lives in our skies constantly. Yes? All right. She also worked as a freelance, she worked for surface weapons in the Navy in Dahlgren, Virginia, and she also worked as a freelance editor in Hawaii for many defense contractors trying to get work with DARPA. DARPA is a very black entity in the United States with bottomless funding for weaponry and psychological warfare and biological warfare and anything that you can think of that's dark in the human psyche and the human environment that can be used as a weapon. So my mother saw lots and lots of things, okay, as an editor. That is when I started writing this book, The Sun Thief. Die Sonnendiebe is what it's called in the United States, what it's called in Germany. I did it, to begin with, to try to make some sense of what had happened to my mother, to see if I could figure that out, to recall incidents that I knew that we'd been through together, to see if I could find a trail, because I knew there was a trail. And sure, there is a trail. But as I was doing the research for this book, what I discovered was the smallest amount of research online reveals exactly what's happening to us right now in terms of changing us physiologically, in terms of changing our environment, in terms of enacting mind control programs that I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about later as well, that begin and end with the birth of the child, and that end with a citizenry that can be asleep at the wheel while the government steals our children from under our noses and do very little about that. And this is global. And it's not just that. That's just one symptom of our transformation from the spirit human to the human they want us to be now, which is compliant and complacent and brainwashed and unable and passive and hooked into the plasma screens, yes? And completely unable to act as a sovereign individual anymore. This is what we have become, and it has been on purpose. It has been step by step. It has been done to us, you know, via a plan, and with the cooperation of several global entities, yeah? You can find out about this just like that. Just go online and type in chemtrails, type in aerosol, the aerosol wars, type in geoengineering, type in electromagnetic weapons, and it will all come to you, because I'll tell you what, the only way for this to work, and I knew this had to be the case for a long time, you cannot get these sorts of programs to work, to be enacted, unless you park the truth somewhere. Unless they tell you exactly what it is that they're doing to you, the magic doesn't work. And it is very black magic that is being enacted on us, friends. The truth is right there for you to look at. It's right at your fingertips. And this is what I found out by looking into this just the smallest little bit after my mother died. One of the things that I did, as a matter of fact, was turn that book into something that everybody might want to read, something that's a bit entertaining. So it's a thinly veiled account of what happened to my mother, and I was also able to satisfy a wish of my own. And that wish was that it had a happy ending. That wish that was somehow, some way, it all came to light. And how could that possibly happen? For me, and people will argue with me about this, and I'm not done reading this, by the way, I'm sorry to say. For me, I believe that it will implode from the inside out, this program, because I believe that ultimately the human being is divine, if you will, if you want to use that word, but the goodness of the human being in the end will be what saves us. Anyway, so there is a story of a pilot who gets a plane out and what happens after that. Now, let me tell you something. That's all well and good, and that helped people around the world start learning about chemtrails, start learning about electromagnetic weapons, start learning about the fact that the things that they are dropping on us that infiltrate our body are submicron size. They go into us through our membranes. They are self-unpacking viruses and self-unpacking nanobots that tag us, so that A, they know where that we are, B, they can make us do whatever they want us to do, C, they can change our DNA, and D, they can kill us anytime they want to via that route. Okay, this is serious business. All right, but that's in that business. That's in that book. The day that I finished writing that book was December 31st, 2012, and I was living in Maine still. And at straight up midnight, my house burnt to the ground. The day I finished writing that book. Straight up midnight between December 31st and April 1st. They burned my house down. So do I have any absolute proof that my mother was murdered? No. But I sure have circumstantial evidence that they didn't want me to write that book, don't I? So I went back to into the fire and I got the thumb drive. I don't know what they call that in Germany. This thing that goes in this side. I got the book out. I got the book out because I thought, if you think you're burning that book down, you have got another thing coming. My two oldest children were not home at the time. My oldest son was in New York at college, and my daughter was at a sleepover. My youngest son, the one who's disabled, the one who can barely walk, was on the top floor in the in the house where the fire started. But my ex-husband happened, there are no accidents, to need to go to the third floor to use that bathroom for some reason, even though there were any number of choices, right? And he went up there and he realized that the house was on fire and he got everybody out. Okay. So we got out with the dogs and we got out with the cats and we got out with the children, and I got out with my thumb drive.
Bye-bye.
And that's the result, okay? That's the result. That was only 4 years ago. 4 years ago. That's how fast waking up can happen. And I've gone from trying to understand what it is that they're dumping on us from the skies, that's killing my children, it's killing all our children, and us, in the United States. Respiratory infections from unknown sources is now the third leading killer. That is the third leading killer. It's not cancer, it's not heart attacks. It's respiratory infections that no one knows where they're coming from. Well, we're breathing it in. We're breathing in submicron sized particles of aluminum. The three that they bring up all the time are aluminum, barium, and strontium. Aluminum nanoparticles go to your DNA. They're it's aluminum-26 now. And it goes to your pineal gland, and it hardens your brain, and it's called Alzheimer's disease. All right? Strontium is a bone marrow seeker. Strontium goes to your bone marrow and severely inhibits your ability to make red blood cells and white blood cells, which is your immune system. Why are our children sick all the time? I was never sick, were you? No, I was never sick. I can probably count on one hand the times I went to the doctor as a child. My children are ill, and not only are our children ill, but they think it's the way they're supposed to be. They think it's normal, because everyone's sick. So this is one of the reasons, let me see now, where was I in this narrative? My house was burning down. That's still the tip of the iceberg, okay? This discovery leads inevitably to the push for transhumanism, all right? And the many ways in which an obvious malevolent overlord of some sort is trying to capture us, control us, and eliminate our ability to think critically and make free choices. And this is still just the tip of the iceberg, okay? This path, especially now since my house burned down, led me to move to London. I had to get out of the United States. I was, if there's any place that they're going to bother me, it's the United States. They don't bother me in London, so for what I do. So I moved to London, where my message began to get a bit of traction, sending it back into the United States, sending it into Germany. God bless the Germans, and God bless Joe Conrad, because if you've not heard of Joe, you should have. Because he's the fellow who got The Sun Thief into Germany and got The Sun Thief some recognition and got it translated. And yes, Joe Conrad. And Joe Conrad is the reason I'm here today. So, God bless the Germans, because they've really resonated with this work. And I'm married to a German man, so that helps me as well. But I live in London now, and at some point I went on to work at the People's Voice television station as a writer, a researcher, and a producer. Now, I do want to say a bit about Joe, because he came to London to interview me when I moved to London. He had no real reason to do so, except that he believed in my project, and he did it on it. He paid for the whole thing himself. So I am very much beholden to them. It was translated by a fellow called Harold Kelsvella, who ended up doing some more work with me. He became my co-author on Dangerous Imagination, Silent Assimilation, which is called Total Vernebelt Giftige Krieg in German. That book addresses the social engineering meant to destroy Western civilization, of which all of these electromagnetic and chemical weapons are the armed part. They're the armed part. One of our greatest enemies, I'm so sorry, but it is the case, is the modern school. A school is not an education. There is a big difference between the schools that we send our children to now, which are they are experiments in subjugation, and they are essentially brainwashing prison camps. Now, I'm speaking to you as a mother, and I'm speaking to you as a teacher. All right? This is where they get us to begin with. The schools, they separate us from our children far too early, and they put them in neat little rows, and the behaviorists have gotten a hold of how it is that we move through a school. So we change classes to the ringing of a bell. Anybody ever heard of the man Pavlov? Pavlov's dog, the bell that rings and we do what we're supposed to do? We'll get to the schools, because this really is one of my primary topics of conversation at the moment, of lecturing. There is no other greater tool of indoctrination and subjugation than the modern school, and the following lecture will, I hope, effectively point to the major issues. How our children are being stolen, brutalized, injured, robbed of their natural birthright, sterilized, and genocided, all while they're still at home. All while they're still at home. They're not just being taken away, which I find to be a desperate endgame move. I think that this isn't happening fast enough, so they're just ripping our children out of our homes. All right? But long before then, we are subjected to this other mechanism of brainwashing. I was, my children were to a certain extent, my mother was. It's been going on for a few generations now, and it's now perfected. Okay, so in that way, it's a bit of a different sort of lecture for this conference, and it's infinitely preferable, obviously, to have one's child safe at home. We don't have to say that, right? These are two different things that we're talking about. As I said before, I consider myself to be extremely lucky that my children stayed at home with me. However, the sort of abduction I describe is also very real, and it has to be deconstructed and stopped, because it is how the rest of the citizenry has become passive sheep. They refer to us as herds. All the social engineering, the social data gathering is meant to move the herds. All the gathering of blood types and DNA, genomes, that's meant to move us around the planet in the way that they want us to. This grab for our children, oh wait, for eons there's been one long battle, one long chase, one long goal, the control of humanity. The 20th century, which I call the lost century, saw the final desperate push to get children away from their families. It may seem that this is new, but in fact, a situation in which a government agency can simply decide you are unfit to keep your own child in your home, that's a phenomenon of the 20th century. It's simply been sort of legalized now. However, the grab for children has been an insidious, poisonous grasp, a grasping and a rending and a tearing, and my particular journey down this path began when I started trying to understand the mental hamster wheel we run on regarding the aerosol wars. How we could become a people who could do this to ourselves and others quite happily, assuming we're doing something good for humanity, or perhaps because we have no feeling for humanity at all. Have you run across a social worker who thinks they're doing exactly the right thing for the child by ripping it away from its mother? We become convinced that we're doing the right thing. That's what the brainwashing is about. And that's how a significant portion of these people can continue to do these sorts of things that make no sense to us, that are clearly brutal, that are clearly evil. We're trained to do it in real ways, like robots. It's important to note that the same research I've conducted into why we became people who allow ourselves to be poisoned from the air applies to how we became people who are intensely vulnerable to the snatching of our children from our homes, and the citizenry at large is simply allowing it to happen. This is as a result of the very same social programming and mind entrainment. That much of the world stands by while children are either destroyed through vaccines or snatched from their homes by the predator state is evidence that the social programming of the Tavistock Institute and the Frankfurt School combined, which was the mass push of the 20th century, has done its job. That we stand by and participate in these travesties is a witness to that. The main idea is that breaking up the nuclear family and getting children under the control of the parasitic predator, whether that's the state or something else, comes under many, many guises. Some are obvious, and some are obvious when they are explained. For one thing, the schools exist to steal the minds and souls of our children. They began as a factory turning out willing soldiers and became centers of subjugation where behaviorists and social scientists could test herd behavior and, frankly, enact standards that are little more than eugenics at work. Secondly, the sacred masculine and the sacred feminine, all but destroyed on the physical plane by the Tavistock Institute and the Frankfurt School, have left our young ones frighteningly vulnerable. We will discuss just a few ways that this was achieved. Third, the hologram created all around us in the 20th century was meant to fill the void created in our children and eventually in us as we became adults. Set the government, the church, the military as our surrogate parents. I will juxtapose, I'm going to take a second here and juxtapose two statements for you. Johann Fichte, following the Battle of Vienna, delivered the address to the German nation. And in the address to the German nation, he frankly said that it is clear that German parents can no longer be trusted with their children. Did you know that? He said that. That was just prior to the establishment of the Prussian education system, which has traveled the globe and been mutated and used for nefarious purposes, but we'll talk about that. Recently, the travesty of the presidential elections in my own country, which sees Hillary Clinton up for election, Hillary Clinton says the same thing. She's not the only one. We've been saying it for centuries. She says the state has primary responsibility for children and the parents are secondary. This is part of her running platform. And we just accept that. We just accept that. We almost don't even hear that anymore. But you see, people have been saying this for centuries. It's still being said. All right. So we have the government, we have the church, we have the military as surrogate parents, and we have the school as surrogate parents. In the United States, we have this thing called in loco parentis. This is the right the school has to do whatever it will with your children, whether or not the parents agree or not. In loco parentis. There is no such law. There is no such right, by the way. But we just make up what we need, apparently, as we go along. Television and the flat plasma screens of all kinds have worked their way into our neurology. They formed a symbiosis and in some real ways are trying to become part of us. As a Waldorf teacher, I spend a great deal of my time talking to parents about screens. And the early, putting your children in front of screens very early. And how that makes them very passive because it interrupts the neurological hardwiring that's supposed to be going on in there. It short circuits that hardwiring. It makes us very passive, and in real ways, it hardwires us to this screen. This is making a different kind of human being. And I see injured senses in children as a teacher all the time because of these kinds of things. How many of you walk around watching people do this? They can do anything they want to out here, can't they? Anything they want to out here because that's our world. That's our world. Put it down. Just put it down, please. It'll be harder to get your children to put it down. But you can do it. I know you can do it. I did it, for the most part. Finally, we add something that seems to be known as the Panther Project. Now, whether or not it's actually called the Panther Project is still under investigation by myself. But the parts of the Panther Project are all too real, and so I'm going to go ahead and talk about that. They're components that have to do with the aerosol war, chemtrailing, Monsanto and what they're delivering through foods, and glyphosate and altering what it is that we put in our body. The pharmaceutical companies, who are huge in the United States. I don't know how huge they are in Germany, but I suspect they're about the same.
So I want to buy Monsanto actually, so you know.
There you go, there's 3 instead of 4. They're consolidating. Good business, right? Yeah. And the poisonous medicines and the vaccines. Each of these things is meant to do something. But in the end, the final product, if you will, of a human being that's not quite human, whose DNA has been taken over, they need some of these parts to work together. And that should answer a question that many people do tend to have, which is, if they can do it all from the sky, why do they bother vaccinating us? Because they can't do it all from the sky. They need to get some things into our body via the vaccines. They all work together to create this thing that isn't quite human anymore, but is compliant to the will of the predator or the parasite. The parasite is just as good, if not better, a way to describe, this global entity that is using us literally as human resources. Human resources. Do you have a human resources department in your company? We always do in the United States. But human resources is an abhorrent term. It really is. All right, so this is a new presentation. I've just put it together. I don't know how it's going to work. Let's see if it's any good. It may not be any good. We may just decide to ignore it. I don't know. All right? So I'm going to quickly go through some of it because it will tell you a little bit about me. What has been and continues to be the systematic subjugation of the human spirit? We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that right now. A little bit more about me. The foundation of my work is the identification and recovery of our conscious understanding of the imagination. Does that surprise you? Let me tell you something. You are a prize. All human beings are a prize to those entities who aren't quite human. You have artificial intelligence. You have perhaps entities on this planet that don't belong, that aren't quite human. Rudolf Steiner in 1900 said that there were entities roaming this planet who weren't human. All the way back then, people have been talking about this kind of thing, all right? That you are a prize. Can I tell you how it is that you are a prize primarily? You are a prize because you have an imagination. You have been taught to relegate your imagination to the dustbin, basically. That it doesn't mean anything. It's a figment of your imagination. Yeah? It's one of those things as human beings that we should ignore, get rid of. Our right brain and our left brain have been taught not to work together, when in fact that's not natural. That's not the way it's supposed to be. They naturally and ordinarily work together. And if you get the right kind of education, if you don't get an education that separates those two things, they do work together. And you get to use the thing about you that is the most mighty, and that is your imagination. My postulate, and I absolutely believe this to be true, is that our imagination is the translating mechanism between the morphogenic field, which is the stuff out of which things are made in this material plane, and the material plane. That is how important you are, just as a human being. You can do that, and no other entity can. And that includes this artificial intelligence thing that's taking over our planet, that would like to be a co-creator, that would like to be able to create, but cannot create, and can only create dead, non-living things. And so, job one is to use us for that. To secure our willing or unwilling cooperation, to use our imaginations, to make material in the world the things that this parasite wants to be made material. That is how important you are, just as a human being on this planet the minute you're born. This is what you have. You are a rare gift to this universe, and I believe we are the only ones who can do it. I also postulate that we have on this planet a predator. I have said this. It is an entity that feeds on our energy, whether the energy is physical or emotional, and that the high pitch of negative energy is its preferred harvest. Which is why we are always on the verge of World War III. We ever going to have World War III? No, because all they really want is that high pitch of, is it going to happen? When's it going to happen? That's what they're after. They harvest that energy, that negative energy. And I recently did some research that will be interesting to some of you, to you here who have this horrific thing going on in your lives, that one of the things the behaviorists found out in the 20th century, I believe it was Herbert Maurer who did this study, was that a human being can be conditioned. Let us say you're at a university and you agree to participate in some kind of experiment where you receive a shock, yes, at periodic intervals. And during the course of this study, they decide not to shock you. They decide to make it very random. So you're not really sure when it's going to happen, or if it's going to happen, or how bad it's going to be, or all of that. Do you know what they discovered? That's a higher negative energy level. That moment, those moments when you're not really sure if it's coming. Is it coming? Is it not coming? That's a higher negative energy, and they keep us in that. All you have to do, if you don't do anything else based on my lectures, is hold that in your mind and look around and see the ways in which they have us at fever pitch all the time for various reasons, all right? So I maintain that the abduction of children continues at a fever pitch, even when they are asleep in their own beds, seemingly safe at home, through these mechanisms. All right, birth in the nuclear family. Am I done with this? I don't even know. All right. Recently, I have discovered, and I won't spend too much time on birth, but it's important, that they first start trying to separate us from our nuclear family, from our parents at birth. And the way that they do this is very simple and very, I hesitate to use the word interesting, but it's very simple. First of all, a significant portion of us are not born via the birth canal, so our skin is never turned on. We come out, we come ripped out through a hole in our belly, yeah? Second of all, as soon as we're out, they cut the umbilical cord. Do you know what that means? 60% of our blood is still in the amniotic sac. It's not in us. They cut that cord with 60% of our blood still outside our body. Then what do? They put ointment in our eyes. Yeah? You remember this? I mean, I had children in the hospital. The first thing they do is stick ointment in our eyes. We can see our mothers at birth. We can see them from here to here. They don't want us to see our mother at birth. They don't want us to bond with our mothers, our parents at birth. That's the first place they start to get us, is at birth. Then they take us away from our mothers. They scrub off anything that has to do with scent, right? Well, this is how my baby smells, this is how I smell, this is how we smell together, because they were just in my womb. We've got to hose all that off, wrap the baby up, weigh it, measure it, because it really is just merchandise. And then we give it a vaccine, and we prick its heels so we can get a DNA sample. That has nothing to do with putting vitamin K in your child's body. They're getting a DNA sample from your child. All right. And then, if you're really unlucky, my oldest son was born in 1993. My daughter was born in 1994. The difference is, from 1993 to 1994, they started giving babies the hepatitis B vaccine in the hospitals. That's the difference. Before they even hand them back to you. My daughter has autism. My son's okay. My daughter has dyspraxia. My daughter has a metabolic disorder. My daughter is in constant, unremitting pain, 24/7, and has been since she was 10 years old. She has live MMR in her gut that will never go away, as far as I know. I mean, there are ways to address this. The difference is she got a Hep B shot, and my son did not. And in the United States, they can take your baby away and put it in foster care if you refuse that shot, that vaccine. Even though there's no law that says you have to have it. So it starts at birth. It starts at birth. All right? Then they take our children away from us far too early, and they put them in schools, and they make it so that both parents have to work. And I stayed home with my children, but let me tell you something, we were dirt poor, you know. If you opt out, if one of the parents opts out to stay home with the children, it means something big. Maybe you can't survive unless both parents work. That's certainly the way it is in the United States. But I tried very hard to do that, or I would work from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., you know, so I could try to be around for my children. But there's a price to pay for that kind of thing. We also are dealing with right now, everywhere, the early sexualization of children. And let me tell you something, that's been going on forever. And in terms of a sort of institutionalized approach to the early sexualization of children, the first incident that I came across that meant anything to me was the Hungarian Revolution in 1919. The Bolsheviks tried to take over Hungary. There was a fellow called Gerda Ressl. And one of the reasons they were unsuccessful is because they ran him out of town on a rail for trying to introduce sex education in kindergarten. And my understanding is that Hungary is also a very Catholic country, and it just didn't. That's why they ended up getting kicked out. So this early sexualization of children, however it comes, whether it's forced by the church, whether it's forced by pedophiles, which, by the way, people are trying to normalize pedophilia. They're trying to make it, I don't know if they're doing it here, but in the United States, they're trying to make it a sexual preference. Not an aberration. A recognized sexual preference is pedophilia. Okay? What happens to children who are sexually abused? Well, just pick an age, really. Let's say you're 4 years old. Let's say you're 4 years old. That seems to be, the ages of 4 and the ages of 7 appear to be prime targets. But let's say you're 4 years old and you're a boy and you're sexually molested and you're penetrated by whoever, a priest, I don't know, a teacher, a foster parent, all right? What happens? Well, let me tell you what happens. First of all, your spirit is anchored to the lower chakra. The bottom, this is our lower self. There's nothing wrong with it. But as we incarnate, we go up through all of the chakras to our higher self. That locks you into that lower chakra, and it also shatters your psyche into several parts. That, thanks to mind control manipulation, or mind control studies over the last couple of centuries, particularly the last century, scientists have discovered that they can make each one of these little pieces in your psyche a personality. And they can make these personalities do whatever they want them to do, irrespective of the other personalities. So you see, the early sexualization of children is a mind control project. It's a mind control project. And how is that, how are we, one of the ways that we are to stop that is by keeping our children near us where we can protect them, which is one of the reasons they want our children away from us. If I've got my son here, I can protect him. If someone walks into my house and grabs my son and runs off with him, I've lost the physical ability to keep him from that sort of thing, haven't I? So you see there are lots and lots of social engineering reasons that these kinds of things are happening. All right? The behaviorists. I want to talk about the behaviorists briefly. We started with a fella, and this is 19th century. We started with a fellow who knows that that plants will react to stimuli. A plant will turn to the sun. Yes, of course. You've seen this in your own house. This is called a tropism. A plant will react to stimuli. Okay. From there, the behaviorists moved on to, I think, the University of Chicago. They started studying insects and giving them the same sort of stimuli to see what they would do. Obviously, they would react to heat, or they would react to light, or, you know. And the particular scientist who was working on these insects at the University of Chicago called them durable machines. That should have been our first hint that something was really going wrong with how we were thinking about life. He called them durable machines. And then we come up with Dr. Pavlov, who started working with animals in the same way and discovered that you can make an animal do things by operant conditioning. It's called operant conditioning. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, the person that I picked out, the lovely behaviorist, who I think did more damage than anybody else, except perhaps B.F. Skinner, was a fellow called John Watson, who worked at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in the United States. Hello! Oh, now you've done it. Anyway, what his life work was teaching babies to be afraid and finding out how easy or difficult it was to teach a baby to fear something, because apparently we're not born fearing anything necessarily. But he discovered that you could teach a baby to fear just about anything under the right circumstances. This is the beginning of the behaviorists, and these behaviorists have carte blanche in our schools. These behaviorists make recommendations about how our children learn. The things that they learn, they're not the only ones, of course. How they learn, the things they learn, how long they stay in school, all of those kinds of things, okay? So I want to mention the behaviorists because they're very, very important. And if you take all of these things together, then you get to B.F. Skinner. And by the time you get to B.F. Skinner, do you know, because of operant, because of tropism, because these geniuses said human beings will turn away from heat, just like a plant. Human beings will avoid, being burned on a stove, just like an animal. B.F. Skinner was actually able to state that we no longer met the criteria for human. We just didn't meet the criteria for human, and if that's the case and you're a psychotic or a psychopath, you don't have to care about anything that you do to any of us. So what's behind a lot of this is the psychopathy that goes along with all of this justification that came through scientism in the 19th and 20th century. All right. We talk about the systematic watering down of subject matter in the schools as we go through school. It's not particularly important to this conversation, but compartmentalization of everything in our daily affairs is. That started in the 20th century, and that was started by a man named Taylor. It's called Taylorism. And Taylor was hired by the industrialists of the 20th century. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay, so that I can do, yeah. Get back to that. I'm sorry. The industrialists at the beginning of the 20th century were faced with a very empowered workforce, and mostly in the form of immigrants. And this is in the United States. Maybe you've known machinists in your life, but I certainly have known machinists. And machinists were a very powerful lobby at the turn of the into the 20th century, because they had context. They could make the whole thing. And the industrialists didn't like an empowered workforce, an empowered proletariat. So John Taylor came up with this system of compartmentalizing everything. And pretty soon we specialized. And our job might be to turn a screw, the same screw in the same hole, 57 seconds out of every 60 seconds. That was our job. We no longer had this idea of context. And people who don't understand the context in which they're living have no power to argue for themselves. For right, wrong, left, up, down. If you don't know the context, you have no power. Modern schools do not teach context. Children do not know why certain things happen, especially in the broader context. You take context away from a child, you've taken his power to defend himself in any way, because he has no information. You know? Okay, so we also want to talk about the rational versus the irrational, because that came about just about at that time as well, although it has been coming down to us from Plato. Do you know Plato was the first person, as far as I can make out, assuming Plato ever even existed, who said that human beings should be educated to serve the state. He's not the only one. And these schools have been tried before, but in 1805, correct me if I don't have the names of these emperors right, but I believe it was Frederick Wilhelm II, who was in command of Prussia in 1805 and went up against Napoleon at the Battle of Vienna, and he lost, and that was not okay with him, because Prussia had this, you know, this reputation, this amazing reputation, well-deserved reputation for being this force in Europe. And that was not okay with him. It would not do. And so from his rage at the soldiers in his army that had the great good sense to turn around and go home rather than die, came this education system which was constructed to build a human being who knew no greater joy than to die for the state. Certainly in the United States we resonate with that idea. My goodness gracious. It's all about protecting our nation, and I think that's true for every nation during the 20th century. Nationalism, yeah? That's what that schooling was about. And interestingly, I found out recently that at the same time, you know, there's this group of individuals called the Jesuits. And I'm locked in battle with the Jesuits right now, yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, so tangentially, at the same time, there was a pope called Clement XIII, I think. He was so afraid of the Jesuits, he banned them. He made them go away. He disbanded them and scattered them to the four winds. And you can imagine that was not very popular. If you've ever read the Jesuit Creed, the Jesuit Oath, it's blood-curdling. You should read it. It's easy to get online. All right. Then Napoleon captured one of the popes, Pius X, and put him in a Napoleonic prison. And when he was released from prison, he reinstituted the Jesuits. He brought them back together, and they became the attack dogs of the Vatican. Although you know, who's running who is always up for grabs. Right now, I think we have a Jesuit pope, so. The Jesuits are famous, if not infamous, for controlling education systems globally, especially at the university level. So, what a coincidence. We have the Prussian education system rolled out, and we have the Jesuits being released at the same time and coming back as a formidable foe. The Jesuits infiltrated every academic institution in Europe and globally. I mean, that's true today. That is the case today. So we have an agenda. We have a massive agenda that goes to the schools, and it really is predicated on them getting your 4-year-old or your 5-year-old out of your house and in a desk, in a row, in a school, so that they can solve from the top of its head and pour anything in that they want to make them a human resource. It's happened to all of us because it's been going on for a long time. What that led to was also something called compulsory schooling. I assume that we all have that now globally, but compulsory schooling in the United States started about 1850. And the citizenry, the parents in the US were so against compulsory schooling that they literally rioted when they enacted that in the state of Massachusetts, and the National Guard had to be called out, and the children had to be marched to school because they suspected that there was brainwashing afoot, that there was an alternative agenda afoot. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing this to this conference today is because it is absolutely imperative that we start to understand how we got into this situation, what institutions we cannot rely on because they are part of the problem and they're meant to be part of the problem. All right? If we want to save our children, it is going to be through other means. It's going to be through making sure as much of the citizenry understands what's going on as humanly possible, because there is such a thing as critical mass. We don't all have to know, just enough of us have to know. And that will help everybody. And that's a truism. So let's see if there's anything else I need for you guys to, because really this has to support what you're talking about here. There's a school, 1900, look at that. I rest my case. Look, cogs and wheels, cookie cutters, same, robots. That's what they're making, and they're still making them. Taking children away far too early. I guess I should have been messing with my program, but I wasn't. I was too busy talking. All right, this is a grade A, very successful program of fracturing of the human being such that the human being has no immediate access to the spirit self and to the all-powerful imagination. Please, the imagination is everything. The reason people walked away from the Prussian front line is because they could imagine not dying. They could imagine something else. And as long as human beings can imagine something different, we are a threat. It is our imagination. Why do people keep coming up here? What am I doing? Okay. All right. I'm not surprised because technology hates me, and that's fine. I couldn't care less. Okay. The Panda Project. We did talk about that. This is the chemtrailing. This is all of the things that they're dropping into our bodies. Viruses and nanobots that I know that one of our esteemed speakers is probably going to talk at length about this later, so I'm not going to spend any time on it. But these things that control us unpack themselves in our body. They are in there now. I myself was part of a vaccine study when I was 7. And I know that those vaccines had cancer viruses in them. The Center for Disease Control has admitted that. Why in God's green earth did they put cancer-causing viruses in vaccines? Would it be because the pharmaceutical companies want to kill us with their cancer cures? Would it be because they want us sick so they have constant unremitting customers? Would it be because they want to mess with my DNA so that my kids are sick? You better believe that's one of the reasons. All right, so there's the chemtrailing, and there's Monsanto. God help us with Monsanto. Our bodies are absolutely rebelling by the things that we're putting inside ourselves. And I know for a fact, I'm just going to say this, and you sit with this and have it, because I'm very into making radical statements right now, because I am not one of those people anymore who's going to say, oh, well, you know, everybody's where they're supposed to be. Not me. I'm not doing that anymore. I'm kicking people out of bed now because we have to. I'm waking people up with a giant shove. And so one of the things that I say is the food situation on this planet is one of the biggest psyops that's ever been run on us. The University of Saarbrücken and many other universities have proved to a statistical certainty that 24,000 units of biophotonic energy goes through our body every day and back out. The human body is a filter. We need that sun. That sun is how we sustain ourselves. Now, what's between us and the sun? A new plasma filled with garbage. There are 100 reasons that they're changing the plasma in which we live, but that's one of them. And so when you think about those 24,000 units of biophotonic energy, and then you think about the 1,200 calories of crap that you put in your stomach, think something radical about that, okay? Because you're poisoning yourself, and you're doing it on purpose, and you're doing it because you were taught you have to survive, and you don't, okay? The electromagnetic manipulation, I know that's going to be discussed later, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. But I will say that one of the legacies that our President Bill Clinton left us in the United States was a country that's covered with Gwen towers. You know what a Gwen tower is? These are those cell phone towers with all of the electronics and they're probably just radio devices sticking out all over the place. They look demonic. They're trying to hide them inside fake trees now, things like that. But one of the reasons those exist is because A, we are an entity that's filled with salt water. There is this thing called the piezoelectric effect. Okay, they can manipulate us by aiming frequency at us. All right, by aiming a particular vibration at us, they can make us do things. And they know that. And a lot of what they put into our bodies from the air just makes it worse. Makes us more susceptible to manipulation, electromagnetic manipulation, which is coming at us all the time, changing our hardwiring. Now, all of this sounds drastic and dreadful, and it absolutely is. But remember, you are a rare entity in the universe, okay? You are precious and you are powerful. And you have been convinced that you have no power. But the fact of the matter is, you have all the power. You have all the power because you have your imagination, and you have your sovereign humanity, and you have your higher self. And you have some understanding of that as you go along. So immediate steps that I would like everyone to take, and I say this everywhere I go, throw your television out the window, please. Please throw it out. It was invented to program you. There is no other reason that it exists. And there's nothing on it that's redeeming, that's good for you, or any of that. It was invented to program you. That's why they call them programs. Throw it out. Get rid of it. All right? Stop watching the mass media as much as you can. Your best bet is to dive in. I know. Dive into the internet and get some alternative media coming. Then you have to learn how to discern what you're getting, because I promise you, as soon as somebody comes out with the truth, somebody comes out with a replica of the truth that guides you where they want you to go. So you have to be very discerning about that. I have to say that one of the reasons I will never live in the United States again, is, at least if nothing changes, is that they're on information lockdown. If you know anything about being inside the United States, you know that we don't know anything and we're not allowed to know anything. And that's not really, I mean, it's like an electromagnetic prison camp for us. The minute you get outside the United States, you are instantly hit with what you don't know. I took my daughter to Paris last year, or the year before. She was only 19. She called her dad. She called her dad within a few hours and said, "Dad, you have no idea what I'm seeing out here." That's how noticeable it is, all right? The other thing is that I'm very, very lucky in the sense that I'm married to a German man who's an obsessive researcher, keeps his finger on the tabs of what everybody's doing in German, and people in Germany and the alternative movement are doing damn good work, okay? They're doing fine, fine work. I know it because my husband translates it for me, and I can get it out into the English-speaking world. But that's really what it boils down to. We aren't getting any of the information. We have continents that are absolutely isolated from each other. So we have to change that. all right? Put your kid in an alternative school if you can. Germans have problems we don't have in the States yet about homeschooling, alternative schools, things like that. That's how they get your children here immediately. I know my friend Dagmar Neubräuner, who's working up north with Joe Conrad's, has been working valiantly, diligently to try to bring this idea of homeschooling and the fact that Germans are arrested and put in jail and they lose their children when they try to homeschool their children. It just can't happen anymore. It's against the law. Well, they're pushing that in the United States. They're not quite there yet. But it's coming if we're not very, very careful. In the absence of being able to do that without losing your liberty, choose an alternative school for your child. And I do not mean a charter school, which we have in the United States, where they take the regular old curriculum and they just put it someplace else. I mean a new curriculum. I mean, look at curriculums that support the arts, that support your child's imagination, that supports both hemispheres working together, that gives them lots of music. We don't use textbooks in Waldorf schools, and so our children develop memories like we should all have, like we all do have, okay? Everything that comes to you orally is invigorating and good for your child. If you tell them a story, tell them a story because you breathe life into it. It's enlivened rather than reading a story, okay? And frankly, if you don't do anything else, refuse vaccines of any kind. Refuse vaccines of any kind. Do not take a flu shot. Do not give your child a flu shot. If you're pregnant, do not let them talk you into, oh, you should at least have a flu shot. No. Do not let them inject anything into your body ever again. Let me tell you something. There's two things I want to say, because we're going to turn it over to other people who have better things to say probably. But if I have one regret right now, it's obviously the vaccine that my daughter got in the hospital, but I didn't know she was getting it. All right? If there was a time, up until, very, very recently, and my children know this, when all I really cared about was being covered with grandchildren. I said, just go be happy, but I envision myself sitting on the back porch covered in grandchildren. I don't think I want that anymore. I don't think I want it right now. Because it's not safe. Because I don't know how the hell my children would keep people from vaccinating my grandchildren. I don't know how that works now. Okay, so the other thing I want to say, because I say this a lot now, and I've just said it to a couple of people, but I'm going to say it again because I want you to remember it. There's a saying that I like to live by right now. You remember this. The devil said to me one day, "You cannot withstand the storm." I whispered in the devil's ear, "I am the storm." I find that very empowering. Sorry. Anyway, thank you. Thank you for having me, Sissi. Thank you.